Hey guys, Nez here. So today I'm going to be showing you how I make my 3D hooves that you've seen. I've been doing them recently on my movie style MLP plush, and I've also done them on life-size ponies before. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up with our hoof design. I'm going to do something really simple here, but you can create whatever kind of 3D hoof design you'd like. I'm just showing you something really basic. So I've just got my hoof here in Photoshop, and I'm just finding the center of the hoof. And we want to, because what we're going to do is we're going to be mirroring this hoof so that the design is exactly the same on both sides. So I'm just drawing a sort of little crosshairs on the hoof. You can do the exact same thing on a piece of paper, it doesn't really matter, but I like to have all of my patterns in Photoshop so I can scale them, edit them, all that kind of thing really easy. So if you are in Photoshop or you are using a digital drawing program, you can go ahead and use the pen tool to come up with one half of your hoof design. I like to use the pen tool just because it creates a lot smoother curves. If I'm hand drawing, it's definitely a lot scratchier and not so perfect. So I've drawn one side of the hoof here. I'm just going to copy it, flip it over, and now we've got a perfectly symmetrical hoof on both sides. So this is just a really basic hoof. I'm going to print this out along with my leg pattern for my pony pattern, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to trace the hoof and the leg pieces onto my minky fabric just like I would as if I was sewing any other hoof. When I'm sewing hooves, I like to mark sort of the top, bottom, left and right of the hoof. You can do this by folding your circle twice, or you can just do it in Photoshop by finding the center and drawing those little crosshairs. I also draw a center line on the side piece of my leg pattern. This just gives me something to help me line up the pieces when I'm sewing them together. So I'm just going to cut these out, nothing really different, and then we'll start cutting the other layers that are going to go into our 3D hoof. When I'm cutting out these pieces, I like to leave my seam allowance pretty normal for the leg pieces, but I would like to leave an extra quite thick amount of seam allowance when I'm cutting out the hoof. You'll see later that it's advantageous to have a little bit of extra fabric to play with when we're pinning all these layers together. It can get a little bit tricky, so just make it easy on yourself. Don't give yourself a small seam allowance. The next thing we're going to need is some thin EVA foam. You can get this at any sort of foam and rubber store, and people use it a lot for cosplay. Here I'm just using a 3mm foam. It doesn't really matter what colour it is as long as probably it's not a bright colour. And what I'm doing is I'm going to be cutting out two pieces with a silver marking them on with a silver Sharpie. So I'm just going to do one full circle, so not worrying about that inner hoof detail, and then I'm going to cut a second piece that is going to be sort of like the outer wall of our hoof. So we're going to cut out the middle piece in our fabric pattern, so we have sort of cutting out what the frog and the floor of the hoof would be, and we're just going to have the outer rim and we're going to trace that onto the EVA foam. Once we've done that, we're going to cut all of this out, making sure to cut the inner floor of the hoof out on the second piece, but leave that first circle piece whole. The last thing you're going to need is a piece of stabilizer, and it's just going to need to be a circle, just like that, the outside of your entire hoof piece. You don't want to add any seam allowance to this. We're going to be cutting this to be exactly the same shape of the entire hoof circle, and you're going to want to draw in the inner detail, but you don't want to cut it out. So we're just going to be cutting around the circle, and this is going to make it a bit easier for us to sew all those layers together. If you try and sew directly onto the EVA foam, you'll find it's too grippy and it'll really snag your sewing foot as it tries to sneak along. So you want to put that stabilizer on top. It can be either a cutaway or tearaway, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going over to my gluing station here, and I've got my handy 505 basting spray. This is what is used to hold quilts together, and it's quite fine to sew. It's made for people to keep the layers of the quilt together while they're stitching them down. So you're going to put a little coating on the back of your EVA foam, and we're going to stick that exactly on top of the back of our minky fabric, trying to make sure you line up the direction, make sure that your nap's going the right way, smooth it all out. One thing I didn't do is I probably should have ironed this minky first. This was just a bunch of scrap fabric that I decided to show you guys this test with, and you can really see the wrinkles when I'm finished, so definitely iron your fabric, make it nice and smooth if it isn't already. And now we're just going to do the same, and we're going to make a little sandwich with a little bit of more of that spray adhesive, and we're going to put our stabiliser with our design that's drawn onto it on top of that EVA. So now you've got your fabric, your EVA foam and your stabiliser with the design, and we're going to sew around that little design. So I'm just using a standard foot here. It doesn't really matter, the stabiliser is going to make it nice and easy for your foot to glide across. I would recommend using a thread that is a matching colour to the fabric that you're using. It doesn't really matter if you're using a very pale colour. I'm just using grey here, a pale grey. That would be fine for most sort of pastel colours like this. If you're using a medium to dark colour, I would definitely recommend trying to match it, unless you want the line of your hoof to stand out, but sometimes it's best to just keep it subtle and let the 3D nature of the hoof show the shape rather than your stitching. I definitely wouldn't use black on any colour other than black, because you're really going to see it, and it can be a little bit of an eyesore, just in my opinion. So I just carefully stitch around. I'm going to go around this twice, just so it's nice and sturdy. None of the seams are going to pop. We're going to be putting a lot of pressure on this hoof to push it outwards once we start stuffing it, so you really want to make sure that it's nice and well stitched down. I personally don't like to do back stitches, at least in the conventional fashion when I'm doing this, because it can sort of leave unsightly stitch, sort of little nests on the right side of your fabric. So you can press the button to do a tie off on your machine. Most machines will have that, where it just stitches up down in one spot, and that sort of fixes the thread in place. But do watch that you don't get a little bird's nest on the right side of your hoof, because you're going to notice that and it's not very appealing. Once you've finished doing your straight stitch, I'm just going to brush out the underside of the minky, because our feed dogs have really eaten into it and sort of messed that minky up. You can also go ahead and trim all of your excess threads. You can see a couple of little wrinkles here how I mentioned before that I didn't really iron the minky fabric, and it had those wrinkles in it from being in storage, just being a piece of scrap. But you can see here we've got all our layers sewn together, and now we can get rid of any of that excess stabiliser. You really don't have to. I like to just get rid of all the stuff that's around the edge of the hoof design, and you can leave the stuff that's in the centre. It's really not going to make any difference. If you've used a light tear away, you can just tear it off, but what I used here was a little bit too heavy duty for me to neatly tear away from that design, so I'm just going around and cutting off the excess. Now is the point that we actually make the hoof 3D, and this is where our little outer hoof section of EVA foam comes into play. What we're going to do is we're going to put this between the layers of the round EVA foam and the minky fabric, and this is going to make the stitching that we did between the original layers, that's going to pull the minky down into that centre bit, and then this ring of EVA foam is going to push the outer wall of the hoof upwards. That's what gives you the 3D effect. It can be a little tricky, you're just sort of trying to work it underneath. It's like a ring going under. You can start to see already how it's making the hoof look 3D. If you're finding it hard to keep it staying in place, you can use a little bit of low temp hot glue just to make sure that it's not going anywhere. Just make sure not to get any of that glue on your minky fabric that we're going to be sewing. Now that we've got all our pieces in place, we're going to be sewing the hoof to the rest of the leg. So I'm just pinning my pieces here as I would any normal hoof. I'm pinning the front to the front, the back to the back, left and right, and then I'm going ahead and pinning between each stage, doing this several times and then flipping it over and pinning underneath. I pin quite excessively on my hooves. But one thing I wanted to mention is that it is easier to do this technique on larger hooves, especially life-size ponies. When you start getting down to doing this technique on these small ponies, it can get very fiddly, because you do need to push that EVA away from the seam when you're sewing it, and when you're working on a very small hoof, it doesn't really have much bend or flex to sort of get out of the way of the minky that you need to be sewing. You don't want to be getting any of that EVA inside this seam that we're sewing here. We're just sewing the minky as you would if you were sewing any other hoof. So you can see here I'm just pushing that EVA back as I go along, sewing a little bit and repeating the process. So this is quite easy on a large hoof because our EVA is quite broad and we can sort of fold it back. This is also where that extra seam allowance comes into play. It's a bit easier to work with than if you had a very small seam allowance. So it is quite fiddly and it is easier on larger plush. So if you're going to be trying this on a regular, 12 to 16 inch pony, you're going to find it a bit tricky. I even find it extremely difficult to do on my ponies, and I've been doing this hoof for a little while now. So just keep in mind that it can be a bit fiddly. It is possible, but you're just going to need to go slowly, and you might need a different foot so you can get a bit closer to your seam with the EVA foam in the way. So now I'm just taking out all the pins, and as usual I'm just going to cut away all of my seam allowance, making sure not to accidentally snip into the seam, but this will just make for a much neater hoof on the inside, a much neater curve, and after this we're going to start filling and stuffing the final hoof. So I flipped the hoof inside out, and you can already see the 3D sort of hoof coming into shape. It looks a bit wrinkly at the moment, and we're going to do some things to fix that to make it look as neat as we possibly can. So here I've got some polycarbonate sheeting. It's kind of like a very thin acrylic I get from the hardware store. Any kind of hard plastic that you can still manage to cut with scissors will do. So I'm just going ahead and I'm just drawing the circle of the hoof onto that plastic. It's only a couple of millimeters thick, but it is quite tough, and it won't bend too much under pressure. So I'm just getting a big pair of scissors and I'm going to be cutting this out. This is the same sort of plastic that I use on all my flat pony hooves. I get it in a big roll at our local hardware store. It's called Bunnings Warehouse here in Australia, but I think you guys have some different shops over in the States. But whatever you can find, I've seen some people get the backings off, you know, hard plastic folders and books and things like that. But you just want a plastic that is not going to bend too easily. So I'm just going to put that inside the hoof, and I'm going to press it all the way down to the bottom of the hoof. Now if I was making small hooves, it probably would have been fine just to do one layer of this plastic, but I find this is sort of getting towards life-size pony territory, the size of this hoof. I probably should have used 2 layers of this plastic just to make sure that it didn't flex too much. I did find after I stuffed this that it flexed a little bit too much. It wasn't a perfectly flat hoof, it had sort of a little bit of a bend. I notice there's in a lot of life-size ponies that people make, so if you do 2 layers or even 3 layers of that plastic, it's going to really keep the bottom of your hoof nice and flat. And we want to put a lot of pressure when we stuff behind that piece of plastic in the upper part of the leg, and this is going to really push out all the wrinkles, push out that hoof and make it nice and flat and neat. And you're just going to stuff the leg like you usually would. I just used about a quarter or a third of the normal leg length that I would normally use just to show you guys here. But you really want to push that stuffing down. You really want to have a very tight stuffing in there to try and push the hoof flat. You can see here that mine's a little bit bowed, but generally you get the idea. So here's what the hoof looks like when it's all finished. If I'd used 2 layers of that plastic, it would be a little bit flatter, and also I should have ironed the minky before. You can see a couple of little wrinkles here and there, but that's just the minky, that's not the pattern itself. But you can see the sort of 3D raised hoof effect that we get here. This is really fun to add to life-size ponies, and if you're game to not go crazy by doing it on a fiddly small pony, it's a really cool feature, and you can sort of definitely make your hoof design a bit more elaborate or a bit more fun than what I've shown you here. I was just showing something really basic. So I hope you found this tutorial really helpful. If you have any questions, please send me a message on social media or on Patreon and I'll answer them for you. If you don't ask me the question, I can't help you out, so I really want to make sure that you guys get the most out of this tutorial that you possibly can. But anyway, I hope you guys like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!